This is her business card in English and Arabic, which she gave me when I visited her at her home in Saudi Arabia a couple of years ago. And it says, empowerment consultant, young global leader, international lecturer, poet, writer, and photographer. And that's not the half of it. Right? She is all that. She was born to a scholarly Meccan family and is often referred to as a voice for Arab women and youth. She works with established and emerging filmmakers and musicians and calligraphers and artists of various genres, and through mentorship projects for Saudi young people, a project that requires a lot of travel around Saudi Arabia, among other things, because much of Jeddah's arts culture, much of Saudi Arabia's arts culture is in Jeddah, which is on the opposite side of the country from where Nema lives most of the time. As an activist, Ms. Nawwab has been involved with numerous women's issues, including the forced divorce petition and legal case, and the infamous Qatif gang rape, and the guardianship of women. She spoke at international events, including the World Economic Forum, the Japan Expo, and at many institutions in this country and abroad, including American University and Rice, and the London University School of Oriental and African Studies. And she's in this country now, among other things, to talk about her new book of poems, Canvas of the Soul, which there'll be a few copies available for sale for those of you who have cash this afternoon. We'd encourage everybody else to buy it on Amazon. I have her previous book of poems. It's not the first for her, The Unfurling, which you can also see here, because we shared a publisher for those volumes. And so, without further ado, it is my honor and privilege to introduce our guest today, Nimah Nawwab.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Thomas. It's always a pleasure to see some familiar faces, so thank you for having us, Heidi, first of all, and it's good to see Heidi here and see Louis and several, and thank you very much, Kate, for the hosting. Thanks, Tom. You know, being a woman in Saudi Arabia is always a challenge. A friend of mine yesterday said, "Aren't you tired of talking about it? I feel you sigh every time you talk about it." I'm originally, as Thomas mentioned, I'm originally from Mecca. And Mecca is a very interesting, diverse city. It's a global city. We have over 100 tongues spoken on the streets of Mecca. My father, as a scholar who speaks and writes 7 languages, and left Mecca at a very young age, grew up in a house where his father hosted students from all over the world, from Afghanistan, from China, from Indonesia. One of them never left. He married my aunt. And so the globalization in Mecca, I think, affected our lives, touched our lives at home. It's touched my life, it's touched the life of my children, and it changed, it affected our mindsets, it affected our very lives in many ways. And I was very blessed in being able to be bilingual, actually trilingual growing up. So I spoke and wrote in English, and my poetry, just to answer the question ahead of time, is written originally in English. It's not translated from Arabic to English. So get that out of the way. And poetry has been very recent. I've been a writer and a photographer since an early age. I was affected in terms of writing. I read a book by a Dutch Orientalist when I was 14. His name is Christian Snoeck-Horgonya. He wrote about Indonesian pilgrims in Mecca, and he wrote about change in Mecca, and he documented the lives of those pilgrims, and I was very much influenced, and I could see the change happening in Mecca at that age, and I could hear my grandmother telling us stories about her life. So I decided that that would be my mission in life, is to become a writer. And later on, I became a photographer as well, documenting change. And that played a role in terms of other things. And I got involved with films as well. And that led to writing and documenting change. And I think, and when I work with young people, I always encourage them to work in terms of, not thinking in terms of one single skill set, but lots of skill sets that play into your mission in life. So, and I'm going to move off now and go into our meeting today, why we're here. which is women in times of change in the Arab world. And are they really times of change? That's my question. It's my constant question, because we have to question things. We can't just take them for granted. We can't take the reality for granted. What is the reality on the ground? And what does the media tell us? That's a question that we need to ask ourselves. Is the reality mirroring the change that we hear about, that we perceive through the media? So I'd like to share a very short segment about one recent change that happened in, for example, Saudi Arabia as a sample of one of the countries in the Arab world. So if we can run this very, very short segment, please. Do I need to click it myself here? Okay, I'll do that. No problem.
Hello once again and welcome to BBC World News. Women in Saudi Arabia are to be given the right to vote and run in future municipal elections. King Abdullah made the surprise announcement saying the move would be introduced after this week's municipal elections. Women are barred from travelling, working or having medical operations without the permission of a male relative. They're also forbidden from driving in Saudi Arabia. Activists and ordinary Saudi women have been fighting for decades for greater rights. The lecturer and poet Nimah believes it's those years of campaigning rather than the wider region's Arab Spring that has prompted this move.
I don't think it's external pressure. We have been working for the last over 20 years, especially in the last 20 years, towards many things, including guardianship issues, driving issues, and of course the right of women to vote and actively take part in decision-making.
Will there be
the society, so we have to have some kind of voice.
Will there be many women who take up this offer now of standing in municipal elections, do you think?
Actually, there are quite a few of our women who have been working and seeking these positions for the last few years, and they're from all regions of the country, and they've been working towards this with certain targets and missions and goals to address specific issues that relate to the society's improvement and development.
If it is a start, do you think sometime in the future there's going to come a stage when women in Saudi Arabia, under the House of Saud specifically, will ever be completely equal to men?
We're not talking about equality. We're just talking, first of all, of not being marginalized. It's steps. It will take a long time. I don't see it happening very quickly. We've been working, as I said previously, over 20 years. And we expect that the change, even though it's accelerated in certain terms, will take its time because we have a lot of resistance within the society sometimes to certain issues. It's not just a political matter, it's a societal matter at the end of the day. And the society also has a say in it. So once the society accepts the role of women on a different level, their inclusion in political decisions and decision-making as a whole, then we'll run a bit more smoothly, and it will take its kind of in a balance. We think of it as a balance in that sense.
Well, that was Nimah speaking to me from the Saudi city of Dhahran earlier. Our World Affairs correspondent, Emily Buchanan, says this.
Okay. So, what is the reality? I was asked to open a conference recently in Istanbul in October last year. And they asked me to talk about women in the Arab Spring. And a poem came about women in voting. So I'll share that with you before we start our discussion with Tom. And before I do, there are two words in this poem. I don't usually have Arabic words in my poems, but once in a while, I'll include them on purpose with a little asterisk and explain the word. So they're there on purpose. The word awra. The word awra is used a lot in the Arab world, affecting women. Awra means someone or something that should not be seen or heard at all, or sensed. And usually we apply it to, for example, when you pray, you cover parts of your body in their awra. You cover your chest is awra, it's not seen, for example. And the other word is the word aib, which is going against tradition, and it's unaccepted. So these two words are in the poem. And the poem's title is The Tides. The tides. They waged a silent give and take when decades of voices were not to be heard. their very names not uttered. Aura is the voice. Aib is the name. And now the tide surges as new blossoms join older rooted shading trees, as the forest teems with new living cells, brimming with life in the raindrops, falling, falling, dripping, dripping. Just before the miraculous double rainbows of offered new horizons, of new, untapped, untrod arena. And the voices are for once given the right to be heard, given the right to vote, given the right to enter the folds of humanity. And now I'll join Tom and we'll just have a discussion.
Well, you know, not the first question I planned to ask, but one that comes to mind from the reading that you just gave us. Given the right, it seems to me that perhaps the fundamental quarrel that Americans would have with the way Saudi Arabia functions is that the rights you have are the rights that are given to you by someone else when he feels like it, as opposed to rights that you are born with and should never have been questioned in the first place. That's not going to change, is it?
What are we born with? We still have, what's the reality? Once again, when I started, what's the reality on the ground? What are our rights? As I mentioned, our names are not mentioned. We live in homes. Think about the structure, where are we coming from? We live in a society that up to now, our very homes are segregated. We talk about segregation outside. We don't have schools that are co-ed schools. We only have one university that you probably know about and you've talked about, where we have co-ed education. That was forced in a way, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. The very homes, the structure of how a home is built, not just outside. The segregation doesn't only exist outside in public areas. The segregation is within the house. The very home. You get into a house, you have two entrances. One for men, one for women. You have two majlises, two receiving areas. One for men, one for women in most houses. I built my house with only one majlis, one living room. And I got a lot of heat about it because I refused to have men and women segregated in my home. It's very unusual. You break that taboo and it's very unusual. And you have Agnes and you have heat within your own close circle. So you're going against the norm there. So we're not talking about, when we think about rights, it depends on a country. It depends on your situation. It depends on the environment. When we talk about Saudi Arabia, just take Saudi Arabia as an example once again. What are the existing conditions? What are the existing realities? What is aib? What is aura? We're starting from that position.
In one of your poems that you shared with me before we came down here, you talk now about when the hardened bands of taboos break, seep through the hardened cracks of centuries of cemented, walled-up silence. A shredded canvas set aside, a new tapestry emerges with new strokes of images, music, songs of a nation reborn. Eons of timeless taboos, caged ice passions let loose. Are you talking specifically about Saudi Arabia? And if you are, isn't that a little premature?
This poem is a new poem. It was recently published in an anthology called Gathering the Tides. It's an anthology of Gulf poets. And it's entitled Freedom Writers. It's about freedom of speech and freedom of writing. And to me, it was just imagining what is in the horizon. it's an expectation, hopefully, for the future of my young people.
Or a fear, depending on your perspective.
Not fear, it's an expectation. For me, it's an expectation.
No,
because
I mean other people fear it, right? Yes. It's
that's
exactly what they don't
that's
want.
a matter of perspective.
Right.
Because I deal a lot with young people, and for me, that's a dream, where you have. It's not a question of going against. You're just breaking taboos for the sake of breaking taboos. You're breaking them out of a need, a necessary need, when it's not needed. What is a taboo? Brings up the question: what is a taboo? Why is it there? It begs that question. Once again, why is it there? Why isn't the woman called by her name? She's called the mother of so-and-so or the sister of so-and-so. She's not called Maha or Nuha. She's called Abdullah or Ukht Abdullah. Why? Why can't she be called by her name? That's breaking a taboo when you call her by her name. Till now, you cannot talk to in many areas of Saudi Arabia. And what's very interesting about Saudi Arabia is how regional it still is. We still call it a very young country in terms of its unification as one country. It's been there a long time. It was called Arabia Felix. It's been there a long, long time. Historically, it's an ancient land. But under one rule, under one house now, it's been there for 70 years now. And it's still very regional. It's still very culturally regional. Sectioned. When I talk, for example, as soon as I open my mouth and I speak in Arabic, my dialect is very Meccan. People immediately, oh, you're from Mecca, because of the words that I say. And that also it reflects your mindset. It reflects the way you wear your clothes. The way I wear this, what we call a tarha, is very Hijazi from the western region, for example. That my name is uttered by my parents, by my husband, is very Hijazi, because in other parts of Saudi Arabia, they will not do that. They will not say my name. They'll say the mother of so-and-so. So it's very regional up to now. Depending on where you are, depending on where you're born, depending on where you live, you're treated in a certain way. So you cannot impose your Hijazi traditions in the Eastern Province, for example. And those differentiations will exist for a long time. It's very hard to break those barriers up to now. You're going against the norm.
Well, you mentioned there working with young people, and in fact, you were the person who introduced me to the entire concept of a coffee house culture in Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. It never occurred to me that there would be such a thing in Jeddah.
In Jeddah, yes.
Speaking of other parts of the country. And I wonder if you would just talk a little bit about how that actually works, given the restraints on behavior, on mingling of the sexes, on public gatherings, on public entertainment. How does this, I mean, I assume that there's some form of communication now, some networks that have been established. Tell us about how that works.
I think the barrier is broken now. We have with us Ahmed Amran, right? And he's a Saudi blogger. And the barrier has been broken a few years ago by bloggers, such as him. Through Facebook, of course, social media has played a very, very big role. That goes without saying. And even in the social media, some will use their original names and some will not, up to now. And it's not just in Saudi Arabia. It's in Syria, it's in Egypt, it's in many, many Arab countries. And there's still a cautiousness among youth about using their names. And for many reasons. You can't blame them. It's a way of protecting themselves. But it's one way for them to meet. It's one way also for writers. For example, we started a writing group in Saudi Arabia among women writers a few years ago, and we've built up from 5 up to 70. We're active writers, and we started on the internet, not Facebook, even before pre-Facebook, just to get a place, because we don't have writing, for example, forums, we don't have writing conferences, there's no way to get together, just to basically discuss issues among ourselves. So the same is happening for the older crowd as well as the younger crowd, in terms of gatherings, gathering of mindsets, gathering of discussion. Saudi Arabia is not just the only country where the mixing or the segregation is an issue. It's across the Arab world up to now. It's an issue. You might see non-segregated schools in Bahrain, for example, but the gathering of non-segregated groups is still very much frowned upon. There's always a big question mark. Why are they gathering?
When you leave your home in Tehran to go to Jeddah,
mm-hmm.
Don't you need the permission of a male relative to do that?
Within Saudi Arabia, I don't need permission, but I do need permission to. I have with me my passport. It has a paper signed by my husband or my guardian, whoever, whether it's your husband, it has to be a male guardian. So whenever people talk about female issues in terms of whatever issue it is, and I'm going to go off a little bit in terms of the topic, whenever I talk about issues that are related to females in Saudi Arabia, the root cause of all of our issues for many years, which I've been talking about for the last 15 years, whether it's forced divorce, child marriages, travel, permission to even get a surgery done, permission to get educated in a college without your guardian's signature, is, at the end of the day, the guardianship issue. So it's a male guardian, whether it's your brother, your husband, your father. You have to have a male guardian to sign off on traveling, getting a surgery, traveling outside Saudi Arabia, getting a surgery, going to college, and of course, other things. So that, and of course, child divorce, child marriages, and forced divorce. So every single issue we have related to women's issue is the root cause. The root cause is the guardianship issue, regardless. So people make a big deal about women driving, this, that, everything goes back to that. And this is what we have to be aware of at the end of the day.
Muna Abu Sulaiman, who's the director of Prince Al Walid's charitable foundation, told me that to her, this was the fundamental issue. The driving ban, she said, was a symptom. And she wasn't interested in curing the symptom. She's interested in curing the disease, which to her was the guardianship issue.
I've been talking about guardianship for the last 15 years. It's not
Right,
something new. It's something we know about for many, many years. Yeah.
Right, but I've had the opportunity to talk to several Saudi women who have told me that one of the obstacles to progress on all these issues that you're talking about is the opposition of other women. Do you encounter that?
Yes, we do. As I mentioned in the BBC News breaking story, is the resistance within the society. And the resistance within the society the first time, for example, talking about driving, which we don't like to talk about a lot because we do think of it as a marginal issue in many cases, as a symptom. Once again, it's the resistance of women. When we conduct a study or we ask women among each other, the women are the ones who resist the most. The women are the ones who are resisting the change the most. The mothers, I know quite a few Western, as we say, Western-minded or liberal women who will, when you talk with them, they say, well, I will not allow my daughter to drive. Why? And they will say, oh, I will not allow my daughter to do this. I will not allow her to study abroad. Why? Because I'm worried about her. For them, it's out of protectiveness. And they're very open-minded women. At the end of the day, they're resisting that change. And it's the women. And you talk to the men, they're okay with it. So that's an issue. Once again, it's an issue I've talked about in the past.
Right.
Yeah. It's another factor.
To shift gears a little bit, you've told me in the past that your poems have a Sufi orientation within Islam. And that is not exactly the state religion in Saudi Arabia. So how do you get away with it?
Okay. My first book, The Unfurling, was poems that, as Heidi, last time when I was here, we had poems that are political, poems on anti-war, anti-terrorism, different types of poems in The Unfurling. With the new book, actually I've been writing several books. I work on different projects at the same time, and including photography, and the poetry and photography go together, the poetry, writing, photography. So with the new book, what emerged I've been working on 3 poetry volumes. One of them is, I will announce it today, one of them is a very sarcastic book of poetry on the business world. And I've been trying to balance it with inspiring poems about the business world, but I'm getting nowhere, to tell you the truth. So they're all sarcastic up to now, so I'm halfway there. And the other book is, and you can imagine, Sufi poems and business poems. I mean, just the contradiction is just laughable. But the Sufi poems emerged about 2.5 or 3 years ago, and they just came. And that happens when you talk to poets. an artist, and we have a photographer with us, Saranya, and you get inspired as an artist. You get inspired, and the inspiration strikes you, and it forces. You can't say it forces. It just strikes you. It's the muse. It moves you. So it comes through, and it moves you to the extent where you just write. You're basically an empty receptacle, and you're receiving that message, and you let it out. So these are Sufi poems, and if you'd like, I can read one poem. Since in Washington, I'll read a poem about power, if you like. We'll do that. And let's see. And this book, by the way, was a very interesting experience because, as you all know, if you work on a book, your publisher has the right to a lot of things, including the cover. And I insisted, because I work with graphic artists and calligraphers, I wanted to promote Islamic art, Turkish miniature, and what we call marbling, which is Ibru. So I put in the contract the right to sign off on every single page and actually be involved with the selection of the graphic elements. So all of the graphic elements are my choices, basically, and I went to Turkey about three times to choose the graphic elements. And there were some poems that I actually drew the images for, and I gave them to graphic artists to do. And there were others where I had certain images graphic like calligraphy elements that I favored, that I wanted in the book. So it depends, basically. This poem is entitled "The Power Within." The power within. Do we imprison ourselves purposely with the temporal trends of existence? Do we curry the favor of those who can turn aside as the lustrous nets of passions pull them on? Do we deal death blows to hardened hearts as they decay and solidify, when the source of it all can be felt simply by gazing deep, simply giving in, simply yielding to the power within?
I want to go back to Mecca.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure many in this room read a very provocative article in, I guess it was last week's New Yorker, about the physical transformation of Mecca. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, basically where there used to be shrines, more or less, and relics of the Prophet and his companions, there are now vulgar high-rise buildings encroaching on an increasingly vulgarized environment. And among the people quoted in that article is someone whom I'm sure you know, Sami Angawi, who has taken a lot of high risks in trying to oppose what's happening. Is this an issue among the public and the faithful in the Middle East or in Saudi Arabia?
It's a very, very big issue. I've written about it. I actually have a poem on the rape of Mecca. It's hurt a lot. We had 4 family homes, our family itself. I refused to go to Mecca for 8 years. I live in the East Coast. The rest of the family is in Mecca and Jeddah. I refused to go because I couldn't stand the thought of having a McDonald's right next to the mosque. And I couldn't see all the buildings. I felt suffocated because before, when you go, you'd see the Kaaba and you'd see the minarets from afar. And now you go and you look around, and you're supposed to make a special prayer as you get close. As soon as you see the minarets from afar, you have a special prayer to say, greeting the mosque and the whole area. Just it's a blessing. And you can't say it. You're just looking around. All you see is concrete buildings. And now there's this monstrosity that we have, which is the clock tower. And it's architecturally ugly, to tell you the truth. And it's very hard to be around. So what I do right now is, when I do go, I've gone to Mecca and Medina quite a lot recently. And when I do go, I decided to deal with it in the sense of remembering the past and just focusing on the area of the middle area and not look up Because before I'd look up and gaze at the stars, I'd look at the sky. Right now, if I look up, I feel suffocated because all I see are the buildings around, and it's actually affected your breathing because you feel suffocated. There's no breeze anymore. You used to always feel a breeze when you go there, and Ranya's nodding her head because she knows what I'm talking about. But it is a contention. It's something a lot of us wrote about. My father wrote a letter to the king a few years ago. We had another incident a few years ago where big uproar. We had a huge historic Turkish fort at the top of a mountain that was blasted. And we moved, a lot of us wrote about it, activists and writers, we wrote about it. The Turkish government got involved. It caused an incident. You're destroying history, not just destroying spiritual shrines and places. So it is a big problem, and it's something that history will not forget it. And people will not forget it. Yeah.
Then I just have one more topic that I want to raise briefly, and then we would encourage all of you to ask questions. And would you just say a few general words about what's happening with the employment situation for females? You know, in a lot of ways, we're still at the stage where you read about the first female this and the first female that, which means that there's like 10 million who aren't.
Yeah.
Right? And where are we?
The first female, I've been the first female in many senses, in many, first female this, first female that. I don't think the first is a big issue because what comes next is more important. We have a long road ahead of us. The challenge is the continuation in the road, the continuation in the journey, the continuation of progress in a sustained, strategic manner, not on and off, unstop. It's just on and off. We take one step forward, and then something happens. One incident happens, and it's not 10 steps backwards. I've heard other women talk about it. 10 steps back. I think of it as 1,000 steps back sometimes. We had the forced divorce incident, and if you want to look it up on the internet, and we worked heavily on that. We wrote a petition to the king, and I wrote a poem about it. Her name is Fatima. That was the first one. And at the time, what I do, because when I write, as I mentioned earlier, I write about history and change, and I trace things, and I also build up a scenario of future expectations in light of the history of something. So when I read about the first divorce case, and it came across my desk, and I predicted what would happen. The same thing happened with something what we call messiah marriages. I'm not going to go too technical on you right now. It's a certain type of marriage that led to other types of temporary marriages. And I also made my predictions at the time. But the thing is, the forced divorce, at the time when it happened, I said, we're going to have different types of forced divorce. It's going to lead to other types. And within 10 days, I was traveling at the time. I was in England delivering at SOAS, and by then I was working on the petition in English. So we wanted to do an international petition as well, not just an Arabic one, a global one. We did that, alhamdulillah, and it worked because the king, what he did at the time, it led to he got involved, and he insisted on changing the judicial system after that. Because it was a long incident. I'm not going to go into details. You have to really look it up. It's a very, very long story, very complicated story. But anyway, one little judge did it, and then others would do the same. And what I expected was there would be other types of forced divorce. There would be other scenarios. By the time I was out of the country, I was back in 10 days. We had, as I expected, and as I wrote to my other friends who were working on it, there were 16 cases. Within 2 weeks, we had 22 different scenarios of forced divorce. It was ridiculous. And one of them came and talked to me about her own situation. And each was a different case completely, and all of them were forced divorce issues. It moved that fast. So the thing is, when you talk about employment or you talk about social issues, whatever issue it is, it needs a resolution that is sustained. It's not one on, one off, and 1,000 steps back. And that's the thing.
When you say forced divorce, you mean a divorce in which neither the wife nor the husband wants a divorce,
exactly.
But somebody outside the family wants a divorce.
Yeah. And they have kids, and they're happily married. Yes.
You ready to take some questions?
Yes, of course.
Please. You just give me, we want, I think, if you just give me a second, let me give you the microphone, because this is going to be on. There's one of those instruments back there, you know. Oh, we got one? There you go.
Am I supposed to identify myself? Never mind. I have two questions about women's right to vote. Number one, why have they suddenly been granted the right to vote? That's my first question. Number two, is voting in Saudi Arabia secret, or do they have to let the world know and let their husbands and their guardians and so forth know whether or not they're voting the way the husband and guardian would want them to vote?
So the first one is...
And then I have two questions about yourself personally, if I may.
Let's start with the first one so I don't lose track. The first one is...
Why suddenly do the women...
Why do they... Okay, because we've been calling for... Okay, it's in different sectors. First of all, we have a consultative council, which is called the Shura Council. It's like parliament, basically. And we also have what we call municipal councils, which are on the regional level. So you have the huge consultative council, which is on the countrywide level. And women have been trying to get into that so that they can affect the country's decisions. And the consultative council is an appointed council mostly. The seats are appointed, but it is regional. I mean, it's from different regions, different sections of the society. You have Sunnis and Shias in it, and it is a mix. Professionals, college professors. It's a nice mix, basically, which is good. And they're supposed to get even people, and there have a lot of committees on various issues related to a lot of matters in the country. Societal, healthcare, and they have different commissions on different things, even health issues, everything that you can think about, basically in different committees. So women have been trying to get into that. So there's the voting for that one, and then there's also voting for the smaller regional municipal councils for women. So there are two types of voting elections that were requested by the women, where women wanted to be members in both councils, the regional and the countrywide one, and also to have a voice in electing members, whether they're male or female members. So that was the other issue. Now, when the king announced the voting, there was a time mentioned by him as well, was that the next municipal election and the next council, consultative council, which the next consultative council session voting was for next 4 years. So our question is, what's going to happen in the next 4 years? In the meantime, nothing's going to, we still have 4 years. But at least it's a welcome step that he put it as a royal decree. So once he puts something as a royal decree, he decrees it, then hopefully it will happen.
But why did he do that?
Because women have been asking for it for the last 10 years or so.
And did religious leaders object to his granting the right to vote?
You see, that's the thing. He took that step, which is a bold step in Saudi Arabia.
And he's higher than the religious leaders?
Yeah. Yes. Just as he did with the judicial reform in terms of the forced divorce. That kind of thing. Okay, your next question
was secret ballot or...
No, it's not secret, yeah. The other thing, and then it also begs the question is, okay, when women vote, do they have to go through their male guardian once again to be able to submit their votes, basically. That's another thing that came up.
They do still?
That's the thing we were asking for, is without male guardianship.
We don't know yet what the rules of the voting will be?
We're still working on it. We want it without the male guardianship involvement.
Okay, then I have two questions about you personally. Okay. Where did you meet your husband is the first
that's
question.
very personal, excuse me.
And secondly, I mean, how could you without the guardian around and all that? Secondly, is it completely voluntary on both sides? You weren't pushed into a particular...
You're serious, right?
Of course I'm serious.
Okay.
I'm an American.
Okay. I got married when I was I got engaged when I was 17. And I have two young people who are now in their 20-something. Yes, so...
Why did you get engaged?
Why did I get engaged? You have to understand, in Saudi Arabia we have a lot of arranged marriages, and we also have marriages where people meet. Mine was, I considered mine a mix, because I knew him, and he's also a very distant, very, very, very distant relative, so I knew him that way, basically. And I went how do you say it? Sufi way or the religious way also in the sense that I did a prayer which is, it's very complicated. My story is very complicated, by the way. I would spend an hour just to explain the various factors that led to it. So that's why I'm saying, are you serious? Because it is complicated. There's a prayer that we make which is called Salat al-Istikhara. It's when we take a step in life that's very serious. So I did that prayer, and it's either you have a dream, and Sufis believe in this prayer a lot, as well as all Muslims do. You either have a dream, or you feel a feeling of comfort, or something happens and matters move along very smoothly, or they don't. So I did that, and alhamdulillah, we had a nice dream, and it went well. And I was very lucky, and I was very young. I was very, very young at the time. So, yeah. Anybody else?
Thank you, Ms. Nema. My name is Jemena, and I'm from the Brookings Institute. And I had a question. I'm originally Syrian, and I know that the treatment of women in Syria is a bit different than in Saudi Arabia, but the issues, like you mentioned, are across the board. Recently on Al Jazeera, they had a discussion about the opportunities available for women with powerful and influential male relatives versus women who do not have this.
In Syria?
All over
Arab world.
The Muslim world, but especially in the Arab world. And I think it's very good that we've seen a lot of women who've been outspoken all across the Arab world. But do you feel that these women tend to be the wives, the sisters, the nieces or what have you of powerful men, and that's why they are where they are?
I think the majority that I've met up to now, I'm one of the few that isn't. And you're right. I've noticed there is a trend, like when I meet them at conferences, they are part of either, absolutely. And the opportunities they're given, why does it happen? I try to, once again, as a writer and a researcher, I was looking into the reasons and the roots of it again. And the reasons are, for example, I studied my whole life in Saudi Arabia, but I was lucky in terms of my education, because it goes back to education. The root is education. And if you're educated enough and you know different languages and you're able to present your thoughts and in a logical manner and all that. And so what happened is I was very lucky. My father's a scholar with 7 languages, and he was an Edinburgh scholar, and all that. So, and he taught me at home a lot, basically. He worked a lot on my different skills. So I was very lucky in that way. And he was a self-made man, middle class, from Mecca, and all that, but he's not a powerful businessman or a royal or any of that. So I'm one of the few that doesn't apply to. Actually, I'm very, very rare few. The rest are all either affiliated with businessmen or with royals in the Arab world. There are a few who've made their way, and they've made it the hard way. I've met a few of the younger ones, because I work with 15-year-olds up to 30-year-olds, girls and boys, or females and males. And they've had a hard time, because they come and they tell me, it's been very rough on them because of, sadly to say, the truth is connections play, like anywhere else, a big role. And it's always difficult for them. So I try my best. Whenever I deal with, whether they're film, I get involved a lot, especially on a leadership basis, as well as artists, filmmakers, photographers, lots of different segments, and I try to introduce them to non-Arabs as well as Arabs across in their field. So if there's a filmmaker, I'll introduce him to filmmakers in different countries, and basically get them, because otherwise they would not be able to get through, and find them opportunities also, not just introduce them connection-wise, but find them institutes where they can go, basically direct them. But that's just a one-on-one thing. They need institutes, and we have that lack of institutes. That's the major problem in the Arab world, is we have a huge lack of institutes where our young people can go and get that backing. Instead of using connections, for goodness sakes, we need those institutes, and we don't have them that would build their skills and get them there. Yeah.
You talked about working with young people through the arts, all right?
Mm-hmm.
So now you're talking about filmmakers in a country where there are no movie theaters, musicians in a country where there are no concerts, and artists in a country where there's no representational art. It seems to me like that's a pretty difficult trail to choose if you're talking about social progress.
That's true, absolutely. But I don't limit myself to Saudi Arabia. That's the thing. So I'll introduce them to people from different countries. If I limit myself, I'm not going to be able to let them grow. So I need to think out of that little area, basically.
Anyone else?
So nice to see you again.
Nice to see you as well.
Thank you. My question is really one of a regional nature. We're talking about this being a time of change in Saudi Arabia. To be sure, this has been a historical time of change in the region. There's a good deal of concern in, shall we say, post-revolutionary Egypt, post-revolutionary Tunisia, that many of the social norms and mores against which you are currently battling in Saudi Arabia are being felt or being introduced in some cases in these other post-revolutionary societies. The Salafist movement in Egypt, for example, and certainly there have been pronouncements in Tunisia which are very troubling to women who have had a good deal of opportunity in the past. I wonder if you could address that and the influence of some of the old school Saudi norms on these new movements.
We've had, among our youth specifically, it's very interesting to see what they're thinking. We have, I don't want to say, we were talking earlier today with Kate. Yeah, we were talking earlier. It's all a matter of perspective. When you think, are they radical? Are they liberal? But we have many, many segments in our society. And what's very interesting to see is within, when I look at it from perspective, and once again, I'm going to go perspective of a writer or a researcher, because that's, for me, is the best way of looking at it, because it's more analytical than, it's not subjective or emotional, it's more analytical. So look at it from a point of view of just one simple family. Narrow it down to a family of 5 or 6 members. And you will find one young man who is very religious, and one young brother who is extremely liberal, and one who might be an atheist. Okay. We talk. Yes, they do. They do admit it. And a sister who covers completely and wears gloves, and a sister who is liberal. So within, and that is true, by the way, I'm not making up, that is actually a reality within families. Not one family. I can see it across the board in many, many, many families, regardless of where they live. Whether it's the East Coast, whether it's the West Coast, you sit and talk at dinner, everybody's fine. The best thing to do is just not to talk politics or religion. Avoid those 2 topics, because otherwise it's never ending. Just to maintain peace. That's it.
Have time for one more, sir.
If you take a look at the public opinion polls in the Arab world, if you take a look at the powerful tweeters in the Arab world, religious scholars have a tremendous clout. On the other hand, you have somehow progressive royal family that trying to introduce change in Saudi Arabia. If you take a look at Islam itself and the non-segregation of Mecca itself, how come I'm missing something? Why the scholars are taking such a hardliner versus the more moderate kind of Hijazi?
You have to explain to me what you just said.
Well, I see Islam as more like, or the royal family is trying to introduce some kind of progressive changes. The scholars are taking a hardliner kind of, especially the powerful scholars who are really followed in the Arab world. You don't see any kind of bridging the gap between the two, between the progressive, according to Islam. I'm not saying like going into outside kind of pressure or something like this. According to Islam and according to the treatment of women in Islam, in Mecca itself, in the Haram itself, you don't see any way of bridging the 2 gaps. You don't see those religious scholars somehow advocating for women's rights.
You're talking about, okay, first of all, you're talking about religious scholars from Saudi Arabia?
Yes.
Specifically? Yes. But are they followed across the Arab world or just in the country?
According to Cloud, it's an international. The top 10 most followed on Twitter are, 4 of them are Saudi scholars.
4?
4 of them
Okay.
are Saudi scholars.
That's interesting.
1 royal family member, and the rest are the media. And they're very, very powerful. They're the most followed.
Okay. Okay, that's interesting to know. Well, I'll have to remember that fact. Okay. The meeting is going to be very hard. I myself find it very hard when I go to Mecca and I pray, and they'll come and they'll kind of zero in on somebody who's on there meditating, for example, and sitting there for a long time, or not necessarily a long time, but who's really, when someone is in a mode of meditation, it shows. And then you have someone come in there and leave the others who are talking. And I've had that happen to me, and I was thinking, why is it happening over and over? And it's like on purpose. Finally, I came to a decision, they're doing this on purpose. I'm sitting there. I go and I sit next to a family, for example, that's talking. They're not praying. And I sit in front of the Kaaba, and I take out my prayer book, and I'm sitting there for less than 5 minutes. And I go deep into it, and then they'll come and they'll start bothering me. This family's been sitting there for 45 minutes talking. They're not being bothered. So why are you zeroing on to the person who's now praying and telling them to stop their prayer and move? It just doesn't make sense. So it's a whole outlook. It's a whole outlook. It's a whole outlook, and it's a policy. And I don't think there's going to be an easy meeting between liberals and extremists. And a lot of us are against extremism. There's a big difference between fanaticism or extremism and what is reasonable and moderate. Islam has been hijacked. I have poems about that. The peaceful in our word, the word Islam means peace. That peace has been pulled out of our religion and replaced and been hijacked by radical elements and extremism. So it's very hard, and it's hard for, what makes it harder and what makes it sad is our young people that get pulled into that element. And then you have other young people who as a reaction go another extreme. And so where is the middle ground? Where's the middle ground of the moderate Muslim? And that's a question many of us talk about, basically. I think we're running out of time.
We are, but
Yeah, okay.
you're here on a vulgar commercial business trying to sell some books, right? Get down to the real issue here. I think I'm going to. I would have answered that question differently, not being neither Saudi nor Muslim. And in response to something that you said, madam, right? The ulama, the religious leaders, religious scholars, are employees of the state. Okay? In Sunni societies, not in Shia Islam, right? And a lot of people think that they always say, well, you have to abide by tradition, and we have to, but when the king wants to, he overrides them. That's why they have schools for girls and television.
Yes, yeah.
And people want to know, well, if the king can, why doesn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, that's... it's not, yeah, he's over 80. He's over 80.
Thank you very much for being here, ladies and gentlemen. And Nema, thank you for this.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here. And I'm going to turn this back over to you.
Okay, thank you all. And I think we need to